Okay, I'll get started. Had about 8 people on here. It sounds good. Thank you so much for coming. This is a topic that when Steph and I went over the topics that we wanted to do for June, we felt that, like I just said to Carla, this could be repeated every month. It is a topic that Steph and I get lots of questions about. And drilling down to exactly what is a defect, drilling down to how do I serve a notice of defect, and if I'm the listing agent, how do I receive a notice of defect? And how do I communicate this to the seller? So it is a very important part of negotiating a contract. Obviously, timing and dates are incredibly important in this section of notice of defect. So I make sure that we stress that point and that you always are aware of the deadlines, dates and deadlines in your contract. Make sure that your client is aware of the dates and deadlines. Your agent, the listing agent, and you are on the same exact calendar, noting the same exact dates and deadlines. So I'm going to start this out. This was a slide presentation that Steph and I used about a year ago, and we're just rehashing it, but adding comments and answering your questions as they may come up. But we felt this was a very good presentation that hit to the key of what we want to talk about. So defining and negotiating defects, the amendment and the notice. And I love this line. It starts at the time of receiving the real estate condition report. It is so critical in the negotiation of defects and how to write the offer to purchase.
Excuse me 1 minute. I'm just seeing your screen just as loading. I'm not seeing a presentation.
Okay, let me just see here.
I don't know if I'm the only one. I can log out and log back in.
No, it says my screen sharing is paused. So let me see if I can get that. All right, I'll go again. Okay. Can everybody see the slideshow now?
No. Oh, there it goes. Yep.
Got it?
Got it. Yep. Thank you.
It had paused, so thank you for telling me that. A defect is defined as, and this is, I think, some of the root of the problem when we're dealing with defects, because this couldn't be any grayer or more lawyer interpreted than the way that they have defined a defect. And I think it's done on purpose so that it can be eventually, if a defect is not in agreement between parties, that it eventually does go to the courts. So in their wisdom, a defect is defined on lines 177, 179 in the listing contract and in 445 and 447 in the offer to purchase. They have the same definitions. That
clarity in my heart and everything. John came over and we worked on that deal together.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to mute, please. It would have a significant adverse effect on the value of the property. So if this defect is allowed to continue in this house, it would have a significant adverse effect on the value of the property. That it would significantly impair the health or safety, the health or safety of future occupants of the property. So safety is a big aspect of a defect, obviously. Or that 3, if not repaired, removed, or replaced, would significantly shorten or adversely affect the expected normal life of the premises. I think that one is the grayest, but it can be argued, if not repaired, removed, or replaced, would shorten or adversely affect the normal life of the premises. So in a recent redo of the inspection requirements for the state inspectors in the state of Wisconsin, they now have to include in their inspection reports a separate page identifying the defects that they have seen. Their definitions of defects are in their report. It's a little bit different than our definitions of defect, but essentially the same. And now, because we have that page in our inspectors' reports of what a defect is, that can be our source of listing defects and should be our source of listing defects. So, buyer's receipt and review of the real estate condition report. This is why from the very beginning, the real estate condition report does affect how we negotiate and deal with the defects that are found in the property after the inspection. So the buyer sees this notice of defect, hopefully prior to writing the offer. If they see it after writing the offer, that gives them that rescission time in the how they receive it and when and how they receive it. So, but the important thing is, are there concerns that the buyer has with what is disclosed in the real estate condition report? This is the first time when you go over this real estate condition report with your buyer that you see what things are really concerning to the buyer. Maybe the buyer has significant allergies. And so what may be just a nuisance to some buyers, say conditions in the basement or things, can be a really health emergency to other buyers. So this is a time to go over with your buyer the real estate condition report and see how concerning some of these things are that the seller has noted. Remember that there's a signature for the buyer at the back page of the real estate condition report. This is not saying they're accepting these conditions. It just says that they are acknowledging that they received this real estate condition report. So it's an acknowledgement, not an acceptance. Should you address additional inspections in the inspection contingency right away? Line 196, you know, that famous line that's blank and most people used to put entire premises. Don't put entire premises, it already says that. Put on that line additional inspections that your buyer may want to have a follow-up inspection or follow-up report. So this gives you the opening of the doorway with your buyer to get another inspector in on certain areas of the property. And they even give you some examples on that line 196, such as swimming pool, roof, foundation. So it is an area where you want to spend an additional time and probably bring in another inspector. That gives you the permission to do so. The other way that gives you the permission to bring in additional inspectors or further investigation is if the inspector makes a point of it in his report. So those two are openings of the doorway to get in other inspections or further study on certain areas of the property. Says on line 200, buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulted from an authorized inspection, provided the inspector or the independent qualified third party, provided they occur prior to the deadline specified in line 206. Inspections shall be performed by a qualified independent inspector or qualified third party. So if it's mentioned in the report, or if you have put something on line 196, that's where you can do it. So this is why this all starts at the beginning. Should repairs be requested in the offer to purchase? They can be. You can put under special provisions, you know, seller to repair brick sidewalk leading to the property. I mean, things like that that you are aware of. You can't use it as a defect because you are aware of it at the time of writing the offer, but it doesn't prevent you from asking for repairs. Should you have conversations with the listing agent? Prior reports available. Sometimes the pre-inspection report is critical, and most listing agents will advertise the fact that they have a pre-listing inspection. Yes, have conversations with the listing agent. You want to know as much as possible, not assume. Should you strike lines 210 and 211, the famous lines? Oh, do I have a story about that? Lines 210 and 211 are saying that for the purposes of this contingency inspection, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual knowledge of or written notice before signing this offer. So things that were obvious to be seen during a showing, the first showings, things that were mentioned in the real estate condition report, items that were noted in a pre-listing inspection, those are all conditions that your buyer was aware of at the time of writing the offer. So they cannot use those as a defect if they want to serve a notice of defect. This is very important. If you don't want your buyer to be constrained by things that they were aware of, you want to know the nature and extent of which, and it may be a defect, cross those lines out. Just draw a line through lines 210 and 211. Then the buyer will be able to review all the conditions of the property, even the ones he was aware of prior to writing the offer. So remember the definitions, the 3 definition parts of the defects, and make sure that your buyer is always alert to this. Should the seller be given the right to cure? Who gets to kill the deal? It depends on the market conditions, and the market conditions that we're in right now is still a seller's market to a great degree. When a seller reads an offer on his property and he is not given the right to cure, that means the buyer has to just object to one defect and the buyer can terminate the contract like that. The ball is in the buyer's court if the seller does not have the right to cure. So we don't want to impart that kind of granting to the seller because it's the seller's market. And he probably is sitting there with a bunch of offers. And if he sees an offer that says he doesn't have the right to cure, that the buyer can just walk as if he gets one defect, the seller's not going to like that one. It might be the first one in the trash. So in this market, because we are catering to the sellers, I would say we always give them the right to cure. But the market will change, and there will be a buyer's market, and there will be a time when you want to put the seller certainly does not have the right to cure. I want to make that determination. So depending on who has the right to cure, depending on if the seller has the right to cure or not, that's who kills the deal. Seller does not have the right to cure, buyer can kill the deal. If the seller has the right to cure, buyer can't cure the deal, can't kill the deal. The buyer will say, I'll fix all those things. And Mr. Buyer, you are still in the deal. It's not dead. And I'll see you at the closing table. Any questions on this part? Knowledge of conditions prior to writing the offer and the real estate condition report. No? Okay. Interrupt me anytime if you need something. this is basically what we just went through, the famous lines, lines 210 and 211. If you want that opening for your buyer, cross those lines out. I had a buyer one time on one of my listings. There. Who just crossed off the word not. So it says defect, instead of reading defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, blah, 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 blah. All he did was cross out the little word not. And it read defects do include structural conditions and stuff of which the buyer had actual knowledge of. So he served me a notice of defect about big cracks in the driveway. And I went, no, 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 you can't do that. You had knowledge of that, just visually see them, plus the seller wrote them in the real estate condition report. You can't use that as a defect, Bob. And Bob said to me, no, 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 Joan, you didn't look at the contract very carefully. You see that I crossed off the word not on line 210. And he had me. Negotiating defects after the inspection. This is a time you sit down with your buyer, being aware of what your buyer is concerned about, health conditions your buyer may have, safety conditions your buyer may have, having children in the house in certain areas. All of these things will factor into if it's a property they can live in based on the inspection report. So you're entering the information gathering period. It's when you have the due diligence to understand this and to communicate this to your client. As a buyer's agent, send over the inspection report right away. I can't tell you how many times we hear about the buyer's agent holding on to the report until they send their notice or till they send their amendment. No. You send it before the amendment, before anything else, you send that inspection report right away. It says that they make timely delivery to the seller. It becomes the seller's property. Seller has the right to all inspections reports on the house. Give the listing agent a brief summary of what was found, but that you are still discussing with the buyer. You know, they get a copy of this inspection report and they're going, well, what does your buyer want to do? And you say, well, we were just still discussing it. It was basically a good inspection, but there are a few concerns that we're going to talk about. So if known, let them know what follow-up inspections you know the buyer already wants to have done. This is that information gathering period. Maybe there wasn't enough information given by the inspector, and so you want to say have a foundation expert come in there, or you want a chimney expert to come in. And if you are still within that time frame of the inspection report, you have the right to do so if it was mentioned in the report, or if something that you wanted to know the extent of the defect. So you may say it was a pretty good report, but we're still looking for more information on the plumbing situation or something. And we will be wanting to have a plumber come in. Give the listing agent that heads up before you even send your amendments. Now you get negotiating the defects. Discuss the report with the buyers, ask their concerns. As I said, ask their concerns about their family life, their living style, their health, things like that, and how this report fits into their wanting to buy the house. Discuss what the inspector has deemed a defect in the report. That's what you're going to use as your source of defects. Focus only on defects. We are not focusing on maintenance and cosmetic issues. You want to be able to identify the defects, and as I said, not talk about maintenance or cosmetic issues or other things that are not considered a defect. What has the inspector identified that needs a follow-up inspection? In this information gathering period, you want to make sure that you and the buyer are on the same page, and the buyer is aware of asking for these repairs, asking for these things from the seller is going to take this contract into its next phase.
I have a question.
Sure.
So with this new way that the inspectors have to do their reports with defects, I'm finding that a lot of inspectors are calling out maintenance issues as defects. So, like, what would, I'm trying to think of an example.
Yeah.
So like 99% of the homes have a grading issue. They always say, you know, look at the grading, and it could be minimal and it's not causing any problems at the time, but it's gone down over the years. So that's usually, in my experience, something that is maintenance, if it's not causing a problem.
Yeah, if you look at the definitions of defect, I can see where you can tuck this in as a defect. If a condition could have an adverse effect on the value of a property, if not fixed, this grading issue
Yeah.
definitely have an adverse effect on the condition of the property or the value of the property. It also, and the third aspect of a definition of a defect, if not repaired, removed, or replaced, would significantly shorten or adversely affect the inspected normal life of the premises. I think it all goes to that fancy little phrase that lawyers love and use, and we should be aware of, is the nature and extent of which.
Okay.
If you're looking at grading problems, some can be done with a rake, some have to be done with a backhoe.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
and-
So say that again, the nature and the
nature and extent of which.
extent. Okay.
That just means a good example of the nature and extent of which, say the seller has put in his real estate condition report, dampness in the basement after heavy rains. The buyer moves in, and the first heavy rain, he's got the Mississippi River in his basement.
Yeah.
The nature and extent of which is vastly different than what the buyer was led to believe. And that is an undisclosed defect. And we don't want to have undisclosed defects after closing. Those are the things that we want the seller to be forthright and honest up front.
And what if they're not, then you
Pardon
would
me?
have to, if your buyer does have, it says seepage, and then all of a sudden they have the river, then they have to seek legal advice.
Yes, yes. But what we want to do is address that issue prior to closing. And a lot of that is the listing agent's responsibility to have the seller disclose the fullest nature and extent of it, you know, not to patty it down and have it be a trickle, a dampness, you know, an occasional spark, things like that.
Yeah.
Want to know the full disclosure. And that nature and extent of which is where the seller can get into trouble.
Yeah, and I do, I like that nature and extent. I don't think that's popped out at me before, because as a buyer's agent, if it says seepage, then as a buyer's agent, you want to find out the definition of extent.
Right. And that may take a follow-up inspection.
So,
A follow-up inspection can say, you know, there's some real damage here that is, you know, either blocked drain tiles or things like that, or cracks in the wall that definitely show signs of a lot of water, not just seepage.
okay, thank you.
So after you've had this, all this information, you and the buyer are sitting there with this report and all this information. Maybe you've had follow-up reports to back up some of the buyer's questions, all within this inspection contingency timeframe. You can't let it run out, or your buyer won't like you. This is the time to say, let's see what the seller will do for us. Let's have an amendment. Let's talk. So the WB-40 is the time to talk about what you want done, what the buyer wants done with the property. And the buyer is free to make any request to a seller. This is a place you could talk about things that would be replaced, repaired, and how it's going to be repaired and replaced, and what do you want to verify that. The more detailed your amendment is, the more you can resolve any sort of agreements between you and the buyer, between you and the seller. So this is the place to negotiate the conditions of the property that a buyer would want repaired or replaced. Use follow-up inspections as a guide and attach them. Well, wait on that. Do items need to be complete prior to closing? Can a buyer take on these repairs themselves afterwards if concessions are made? Say you get a concession of closing cost credits, and then the buyer will fix these things after they own the property. Can you use a combination of repair requests, price reductions, or seller credits? If you're talking about seller credits or closing cost credits, you have to talk to your lender. There is a limit to the amount of closing cost credits that a buyer can get. It can't go over what the buyer is entitled to as far as their lender is concerned. If it's a cash closing, obviously that's not a problem. You can reduce the price, and you can make a request for repairs. Just keep in mind, and that's why I said don't attach the inspection report necessarily, but you can keep in mind in this back and forth negotiations with amendments what the lender is also seeing, because the lender has to see any amendments written. I do not like the practice that some agents do of putting out ghost amendments just between the buyer and seller and not sending them to the lender. That's not a good practice at all. Any amendment that's drafted has to go to the lender if they are getting a home loan. Anything other than that is called fraud. So you have to be careful about how you word this amendment. And sometimes if you don't want to let the lender know, and this is kind of fun, that there is a seepage problem or a water problem or a crack problem or a chimney problem, and all you do then is just ask for closing cost credit, or you ask for price reduction, and then the lender doesn't have to show that to the underwriter, because some underwriters will just say, wait a minute, we're not going to loan them a house that has a cracked chimney, whatever. So, but the amendments are important, and you can have several amendments back and forth. You know, the seller gets your amendment on how things are to be put in place, and he goes, are you kidding me? And he just says rejected. And so then he comes back and says, okay, I'll do this, this, and this, but I'm not going to do that. And you look at it, you go, that's not enough. And you say, no, that's rejected. And then you write another amendment back. You can do it as many times as you want, or as long as the contract stays upright. But the idea is to try to get a win-win situation with the buyer and the seller. This is a good time for you and the listing agent to have good conversations, positive conversations, keeping things going in a good way, and see if it can be resolved with amendments. Any questions about the amendment? Now, people have asked, do we have to do an amendment? Well, if situation where the notice of defect comes up first, that just means that the buyer doesn't really want to talk about it. The buyer just wants these defects to be fixed, or the deal's over. He doesn't want to go back and forth with the seller. This is really not good practice. You should probably try to convince your buyer not to take this route, to try to negotiate first. But in the situation, when sending an amendment, the seller can agree to some, none, or all of the requests. Going back and forth, is what I just said. Seller's rejection of amendment does not mean the deal is dead. Always in this together, try to keep negotiating. But as I was saying, if they fail to negotiate, buyer and seller, that's when the notice of defect is brought up. And one of the things that we want to talk about is how to define the defects that you want the seller to cure, if the seller has right to cure. If an amendment negotiations does not come to an agreement, then the buyer can send a notice of defect listing only the new defects, not the ones he was already aware of, and any defect previously disclosed but found to be of greater nature and extent of the original disclosure. So new defects discovered in the inspection report and defects that you did know about, but you found out through the inspection that it was of greater nature and extent of which was originally disclosed. So those are the defects that the buyer can decide to serve to the seller. It's always in the buyer's court to serve the notice of defect. The right to cure determines who gets to kill the deal, whether the buyer or the seller. So in writing this notice of defect, I'm not sure that's on this next page. Yeah. I'm a stickler for writing the notice of defects on a notice to the offer to purchase. Our form, WB 41. It's the notice to the offer to purchase. It's not called the notice of defect. It's called the notice of offer to purchase. On the first line in the notice, this is where you state, this is a notice of defect. You alert, alert, alert. This is a notice of defect. This makes it official that this is an official notice that you are serving per the contract, per the offer to purchase. List all the defects the buyer objects to. You don't have to list them all. Maybe just list one that's really serious. Some buyers, if they're trying to get out of the contract, list all the defects they can possibly dig up from the inspection report. But you use the inspection report as your source of defects. If an objection to a previously disclosed defect, depending on whether the defect the seller disclosed is of the same nature and extent as the defect reported in the home inspector. So if the inspector notes this as a defect, but it's the exact same defect the seller already disclosed, the same nature and extent, that cannot be listed. Examples. If the in the real estate condition report, it says dampness in a small trickle of water after heavy rains, is what we talked about. In the inspected report, it says evidence of prior water staining up to the first course of treatment block. There, the inspector has said there's a greater nature and extent of which. So you don't have to rely, or you don't have to kick out that trickle of water disclosure from the seller. In the record, they say small crack in the basement wall, inspection report, crack in basement wall indicating structural weakness. The nature and the extent is much greater, so it can be used as a defect. If it is the same nature and extent as disclosed in the record, it cannot be used as a defect. Unless you cross out lines 1 and 2. Okay. If there's, okay, I've said that. So the seller gets this receipt of notice of defect. And what I want to state here, and this is something that I get lots of questions on, is how do you list this? Before we get to this page, how do you list these defects? Some agents have literally copied and pasted the defect page from the inspector's report. Don't ever do that. It is supposed to be on your notice of defect, just a list of the defects, not what would happen if they're not cured, how it should be done, who should do it. You're not putting in this notice of defect, who does it, that you want a lien waiver and a receipt. None of that. A notice of defect is a strict, defined notice that you are only listing defects, list of defects that could be cured. So then it makes it very clear when the seller receives this notice of defect, he is just reading the list of defects to which the buyer objects. Again, title your notice of defects. This is a notice of defects. These are the following defects to which the buyer objects. So the seller gets this. Now you're in the right to cure period. You are no longer in the inspection period. You're no longer in the information gathering period. Now you're in the right to cure period. The minute you send that notice of defects over, it triggers that right to cure line 215 of the offer to purchase. Now you're in this period. The date of, or the expiration date of the inspection contingency is no longer relevant because you have served the notice of defect prior to that date expiring. So now you're in the time period of the right to cure. If you have gone to the default that the seller has 10 days to decide what to do, then now you're in this 10-day period. Again, I'll repeat, you're no longer in the deadline for the inspection contingency period. You are in now the right to cure period. And as I said, the default is generally.
Water Street.
Any questions on that? Line 218 under right to cure, delivering the written notice. Remember, it's a written notice within 10 days after buyer's delivery of the notice of defect stating the seller's election to cure. So the seller has 10 days to say he's going to cure. He has 10 days or to send a notice back saying that he's not going to cure. Realize in both those situations, the seller has to send a notice back. I am going to cure the defects, and that means all of them. There's no negotiating at this point. Or he sends a written notice back, I am not going to cure. Or he ignores the 10-day period. If he ignores the 10-day period, or if he sends a notice saying he's not going to cure, the deal is dead. If he elects to cure, the deal is kept alive and he will fix these, he will cure, fix these defects, and the buyer is going to closing for this property. Now, the contract reads that he will cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner. If you think that's too vague or buyer isn't comfortable with that, put in your offer, it has to be written in your offer, the clause that says if seller has the right to cure, he will cure with a licensed contractor and get liens and invoices and things. There is a paragraph in our library that you can insert right in your special provisions of your offer to make sure that if the seller is going to cure, he's going to cure it with a licensed contractor, and you will get the lien waiver and the invoice. Any questions on the seller's receipt of the notice of defect? Remember, he has to send a notice back, say he will cure within the 10 days, or he has to send a notice back saying he won't cure, or if we never hear from him, he is elected not to cure. Okay, everybody clear? Okay, so that's basically that section. That's basically the rights that your buyer has in getting an inspection contingency, in having an inspection report, in negotiating with the seller on repairs made. And if there's no negotiation success with the seller, then you serve the notice of defect. And then that depends on whether you've given the seller right to cure or not. How that's determined is then the section, a very important section of our offer to purchase. I want to add that this is all separate from testing. Testing and inspections are completely different worlds. They put the testing in addendum A to make sure it's not to be assigned with the inspection. They put radon testing in the condition in the offer to purchase because it was so common. But all other testing, asbestos, mold, all of those things that you have to take a sample of and send it to a laboratory and find out if it's really there, like asbestos, are in the separate addendum A. They don't have to be confused with inspections in any way. Do not put in the testing part. If you're adding testing, do not put any.
Highway 33.
Sure, you mute. Who's muting? Okay, I muted everybody. But it's critical to, when you're filling in the testing on addendum A, that you actually list tests that you might consider. And I would say it would be asbestos, it would be mold, it would be that there are only a few things that can be tested. Samples taken, sent to a laboratory, and then getting a result. Because you can't ask, we just had a situation today where the notice of defect was sent. The buyer did not have testing as a result. And one of the defects listed in the notice of defect was obvious asbestos in the kitchen tile floor. And there was no test, there was no results. They are just assuming that it's asbestos in the tile floor. And they're probably right, because it's the old 9x9 tiles. But that is not a factual defect, excuse me. It's not something that you have proof of. It's not something that is stated anywhere in the inspection report. And it may say in the inspection report, recommend testing kitchen floor for asbestos or something like that. But that is not saying that there is asbestos. And you can't use that as a defect. You can't make assumptions to mold or to asbestos or those items as lists of your defects if they weren't included in the testing and you have actual proof. So it's factual defects that you're aware of, either from reports, either from the listing, either from the inspector's report or the inspection follow-up that you have for your inspections.
I have another question.
Sure.
So if the inspector in the report says that testing should be done on the kitchen floor, possible asbestos, at that time, if you did not have testing marked in your addendum A, but the inspector you have rights to further reports or further inspections, does that include testing?
No. Again, because a test is very different and separate from an inspection.
Yeah, but the the inspection contingency allows for any inspections that the home inspector, finds necessary for further inspection, but then you could not do the testing if he recommends that.
Correct. The inspector cannot recommend something that needs to be tested. He can only recommend other inspections of things, but you cannot determine, say, asbestos in a ceiling or in a flooring or something without it being tested. So the inspection, he cannot recommend a test. And I'm glad you asked that question, because that's a big question that we get a lot, but it has to be, and that's why you don't put in that testing line, any test recommended by the inspector. You have to literally write out what test you want to have the right to do in that testing in addendum A. So you can't just think of it as you can't crisscross testing and inspections, because they're separate activities.
Yeah, that I just, on the buyer side, that's just kind of like, well, if you weren't aware of it and now, the inspection points out something.
So you really have to, as an agent, have very good eyes to spot something that might be a potential concern, like mold.
Exactly. And that's
Upfront.
going back to like our first slide or second slide, is to sit down with the buyer and get to learn what their concerns are. Health issues, allergies, children that have, maybe some need some adaptabilities in a property. Get to know what those are that are important, and then make sure that their offer includes those concerns. So if they really have bad allergies, make sure you put in testing on addendum A, and that you want to test for mold or things like that. Air quality. But that, you're right, the responsibility is on the buyer's agent. And that's why we've done a couple of contract training on your responsibilities as the buyer agent. You have to go above and beyond just filling out the contract.
And then you're walking a fine line of not being an inspector and knowing what's a problem and not.
Right, but as I said, there are really only a few tests that can, that need to be done. You can test for lead, you can test for mold, you can test for asbestos. Drain tiles really is an inspection, but there's a test that can be done for drain tile blockage. But that's one that's always kind of a confusing matter. But just because an inspector recommends something that would require a test in his report doesn't mean that gives you the buyer right to add that. Now, the only thing the buyer can do is try to send an amendment to the seller at this point in time, which is not the best time, is to say, can I add testing to the contract? You would need the seller's report, or permission to add testing at this point in your contract. And probably the odds are he's not going to allow it.
And good luck.
Yeah, right. But, I've dealt with so many circumstances like this as a manager, and now as a compliance broker. It's a very, very common, I would say, negotiating factor that we have as buyer's agents. And that's why we want to repeat this type of training as often as we can, because it always comes up as a question, as a situation when it's after the fact. But it's something that you want to prepare for and have it corrected before the fact and not after the fact.
Hey, Joan, do you have to have any suspicion of a possible condition with mold or asbestos or et cetera before you can add that into the addendum A as a contingency for testing?
Really. Not
Okay.
really. I mean, as I said, in getting to know your buyer, ask the buyer what their concerns are. You may not have any, looking at the house, see anything. Maybe sometimes you can smell a mustiness or things like that. But it isn't something that, you just put it in. And some lenders will say you put in testing and you decide not to do any testing. There's no cause for it or anything. Sometimes a lender will want you to have an amendment signed by both parties that says that you're removing the testing. And that's the only harm to putting the testing. The other harm of putting testing into a contract is you're making your contract more contingent. And if it's in a lot of competition, it's maybe not going to win the competition.
Can
But
you
you're
tell
there-
us,
Pardon me?
sorry, could you tell us what instances lenders will ask you to remove that testing contingency and why?
Well, say there's no testing report and there's no amendment to resolve what's going to happen with the result of the testing or anything. And the lender will look at that and say, hey, they were putting testing in here. I want to know what the results of the testing are. You're not sending me an amendment or something. And that's when you say, well, we actually decided not to do any tests because everything seemed fine. But then he'll probably want an amendment saying that you did not have any testing.
Ah, okay.
And that doesn't always come up, but it comes up sometimes. But a lot of the confusion is agents. They even covered this in this last roundabout of continuing ed. A lot of agents merge and mix testing and inspection. And you have to realize that they are completely separate, and you have to ask permission separately for testing. The inspector can't give you permission. One other situation, I have a little bit of time, I bring it up because it seems to have happened. Negotiation, amendments back and forth, nothing resolved. And so the buyer sent a notice of defects. The seller starts to come around, and the seller says, maybe I can cure some of these defects. I don't want to lose this buyer. But he can't do all of them. Say one of them is significant. And the seller will say, I can fix that, but I can't fix these other defects. What can happen here is the seller can come back with an amendment, even after the notice of defect has been served. And very importantly, the seller has to put in that amendment, notice of defect is hereby removed. And then the seller can say, seller elects to put a new roof on, period. Seller will not cure any other defects. And if the buyer signs that, he has signed the fact that the notice was withdrawn and that they will continue to negotiate with this amendment, that the seller will fix maybe some of those defects, but not all of them. The buyer goes, that's pretty fair. If I get a new roof, I can live with these other defects, whatever. And the deal is put back together again, even after a notice of defect is served. But it has to state in that amendment to further negotiate, this notice of defect dated is hereby removed.
What's the risk to the buyer then, if we're not making a new deadline?
Your deadline then would be on that amendment. That it has.
So if their deadline is whether or not they sign and
Right.
agree to it, okay.
Right, because you're past the inspection deadline, you're actually in the right to cure deadline. But if you can negotiate within that 10 days of right to cure deadline, you might be able to hold this together. Now, the other situation we get is buyers are just trying to get out of contract. They hate the house, they don't want it, they saw another house they like, and they're trying everything to get out of it. And the seller goes, I'm going to cure everything. You're still buying this house. And we get those situations. What do they do? Call an attorney. Because you've got a binding contract. Any other questions? I really appreciate it. We got a good group here today and good questions. This is really, as we keep saying, a very important part of our contract. And with this tight competitive market, these issues are popping up all over the place regarding the inspection contingency. And I think worse than issues popping up around the inspection contingency, in my point of view, is to have no inspection contingency. That you've got to do everything you can to convince your buyer to have an inspection. Maybe it can be an inspection over just a particular part of the house. It doesn't have to be a full inspection. Add inspection contingency, but just have it be the foundation. Or just have it be, the chimney system. But it's a lesson that's been learned 100 times over. Don't forgo the inspection. Any other questions?
Thank you. I have to run to my next Zoom.
Okay, well, the time is up and I do appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. It was a good involvement, contract training. Thanks.
Thank you.